Okay, we're going to briefly go over some of the steps to get the motor out of the Rampside. First thing we want to do is get rid of any electrical connections, and that means always pull the negative first. This is the positive side. That's going to come along with the engine. Here we have the alternator wire. We're going to disconnect anything to do with the alternator. Here at the coil there is a voltage supply to the coil. That's got to get pulled. And then the oil pressure and heat temperature sensing units have to be disconnected. You notice that I've already disconnected the throttle cable. That throttle cable is not the best. Now usually I'll leave everything else pretty much the same. The highest point that I've got to get underneath here is the alternator. Sometimes on these FCs it's the throttle linkage, but make sure everything on top of the engine is disconnected. You'll also notice that I pulled the air filters and the two studs that stick up. Those actually stick up higher than the alternator does. So that's basically where I'm at. I'm pretty much done disconnecting everything on top of the engine, and what I'm going to be doing is everything down below now. Okay, the next step basically is to get underneath and start undoing some of the sheet metal. These are the retainers that hold the perimeter seals. They've got to be taken off. There's one in the front that you can get on top of the engine. These you've actually got to get underneath the vehicle and pull these off, both right and left. On the forward controls, this is often missing. This is actually a pretty rare part. These grills are hard to find because they don't get put back on. Fortunately, whoever owned this Rampside put this one back on. This has got to come off before you can gain access to actually get the engine out of the car. So, on the rear section here now, I've got to remove the dipstick tube. If the Rampside or van's got the correct FC engine. This one does have the correct engine in it, so I've got to remove the dipstick tube. Here is the rear motor mount. Now we're going to want to get a jack underneath it before we start doing that. And we're just basically going to make sure nothing else is hanging up. But we should be good to go underneath and start disconnecting. Okay. We are on the left-hand side of the vehicle, and I'm going to point out some things that are going to need to be disconnected. First of all, you'll notice that I got a jack stand and I've got a jack over here. What I like to do is I like to have a backup system. I don't like being underneath vehicles at all, and the older I get, the less I like it. So I got a jack and jack stand, and I try to make sure that if I've got the luxury of having two jacks, that I put one as a backup system for the jack stands. Now I've already pulled the 4 nuts off the lower A-arm and brought the axle out. And you'll notice that I have already taken the speedometer cable off, which is on the left-hand side of the differential. The exhaust system, that's going to have to come off. And right here, let me see if I can get a shot of that little light in there. That's the fuel line, and I've also got to undo the heater ductwork. So those items right there need to happen. I've already removed the retainer on both sides, and that was in the previous segment. Okay, let me go over briefly what I've got as far as a engine removal jack. The job is just much more easier if you try to take the engine down from the bottom, and always get, on especially early models and Rampsides forward controls, you want to remove the tranny, the differential, the transaxle basically, and the engine is one unit. So what I've got here is one of these $180 Pittsburgh transmission jacks. They're not the best. They have a lot of slop in them, but I can usually get around it. But basically what I've done is I've built this 1/4 inch steel plate, and you'll notice that it's got tabs on both sides here in the back. That's where the bell housing goes. That way the motor can't shift come off easily. In the front, I've got a 3/8 bolt, and here's the 3/8 bolt, and this goes in the rear cover of the engine, and basically that's keeping this thing as one unit. So this plate is pretty hard to find. I had to build this one, but it's anchored on there pretty good. You can change the angle, of course you go up and down, but that's what I use to pull these engines with. It's not the best, I understand that, but I don't pull engines every day, so it works out pretty good for me. Let me just show you briefly what I do basically to organize all the parts. When I get parts coming off, I like to put them on something that has a white background because these are dark parts. I don't like to put them in cans, bags, unless you're going to do long-term storage. So basically these are most of the parts that have already come off the vehicle. These are the smaller parts. These are what I call the connectors. So basically I get a white background and just basically sort stuff as it comes off the vehicle. Nothing, it's not rocket science, it's nothing really big. But now when I go to reassemble the vehicle, I know exactly what's here. I don't have to dig through a can, I don't have to dig through bags. I go right to the source here. Now that's assuming that you're going to do this project in 1 or 2 days or a weekend, which is my plan here today. Hopefully I can get this Rampside going today. So this is basically how I organize the parts, and of course there's a lot more left yet to come off. Alright, let me go over some of the things that I've been doing here. Of course I'm grouping all the nuts and bolts, clips, retainers together. And what I'm about ready to do is I pulled the dipstick tube out of, this is an FC, so it's got the dipstick tube in the rear at the block. Make sure that these O-rings have been replaced. This is a very common leak. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick this rubber plug in the block where it goes, where the dipstick tube goes. And just if you want to go buy one of these rubber plugs, I'll give you it's about 1 inch, a little over 1 inch, and then this side of it, the beveled side, about 1.25 inches, so 1 by 1.25. This is going to go into the block, and I've already drained the oil, but it's just nice to be able to know that it's not going to leak in that area should things shift, or maybe the engine cradle rocks or whatever. This is just a cheap way of having a little bit of insurance. So remember, get the O-ring, change that O-ring. That's a very common area, and I try to put the this rubber plug in. Alright, we got all the motor mount bolts loose. So there's 2 up front, there's 1 back here, and those have all been loosened. It's important to have the jack up as tight as you possibly can get it before you loosen those. I actually like to see the vehicle come up about maybe 1/2 inch. That way I know I've got all the weight I can get on the motor. That way I don't want any motors falling down on my face. So we're just going to bring this guy down the rest of the way here. And just go nice and slow. Okay. And that's basically down as far as it's going to go with this particular style of jack. So the next step is, for me, I'm going to have to jack up the left side of the vehicle just a little bit, just so I can clear the alternator. I'm not planning on taking any of the top of the engine off, or I would probably already have just loosened the alternator, but basically all we're doing is a flywheel job here. So the engine basically is clear, ready to come out. We've just got to get a little bit of, about 2 inches of clearance on this side, and then that'll be next step. Alright, so the next step we've got here is basically just to pull the entire assembly out from underneath the vehicle, and we'll see if we can get it out here in one fell swoop. I see, looks like it's going to come, and no snags, maybe a cable holding right there, and out she comes. All right. Let me just grab this camera by hand and show you a little bit about what I got here. So basically this is the entire, what they call an ancillary, the entire engine tranny combo here. So we have a pretty good size hole here in the back of this Rampside now. And basically we're going to be separating differential tranny, the transaxle from the engine, and we'll be going through and doing some checking at that point. But the engine is officially out.